back on the air. Because we've known each other for over 20 years. I know you as a friend, and here's something I didn't know, is that you're funny.
Late-night television doesn't usually produce genuine surprises anymore. The format has felt predictable for years: a monologue, a desk bit, a celebrity guest, a goodnight wave. But every so often, something happens behind the scenes that reminds everyone just how much tension, politics, and money actually sit underneath those polished sets. The story of Stephen Colbert walking away from CBS and then quietly turning down a lifeline from his old friend and rival Jimmy Kimmel is exactly that kind of story. It has all the ingredients of a Hollywood drama: corporate maneuvering, a presidential lawsuit, a multi-billion-dollar merger, a beloved host's sudden exit, and finally, a personal decision that reveals more about Colbert's character than any headline ever could. To understand why Colbert said no to Kimmel, you first have to understand just how strange his exit from CBS really was. For 9 consecutive television seasons, Stephen Colbert sat at the top of the late-night ratings mountain. Night after night, his numbers beat Jimmy Fallon's Tonight Show and Jimmy Kimmel's own program on ABC. In an industry where dominance rarely lasts more than a season or two, Colbert had built something remarkably durable. So when CBS announced in the summer of 2025 that The Late Show would be ending once his contract expired, the entertainment world didn't just register surprise, it registered disbelief. Hosts get canceled when their ratings collapse, when audiences move on, when a show stops being profitable relative to its competitors. None of that applied here. Colbert wasn't losing. He was winning, and losing his job anyway. CBS insisted the decision was strictly a financial one, framing it as an inevitable response to a shrinking late-night advertising market rather than anything to do with Colbert personally. On the surface, that explanation isn't unreasonable. The economics of network television have been under pressure for years as streaming, YouTube, and social media chip away at the audiences and ad dollars that once flowed freely into traditional broadcast slots. Late-night shows, with their large production budgets and shrinking live viewership, have become an easy target for cost-cutting. But the timing of the announcement made it almost impossible for anyone to accept the purely financial explanation at face value. Just 3 days before CBS pulled the plug, Colbert had used his own show to take a direct shot at the company signing his paycheck. It wasn't a subtle jab either. Colbert's target wasn't a politician or a rival network executive. It was Paramount Global, the parent company of CBS. Paramount had just agreed to settle a lawsuit filed by Donald Trump, who accused CBS News of misleadingly editing a 60 Minutes interview with then Vice President Kamala Harris during the 2024 campaign. The settlement, worth $16 million, was structured so the money would go toward Trump's future presidential library rather than into his own pocket. CBS never admitted any wrongdoing, and plenty of media law experts openly questioned whether Trump's case had much legal merit in the first place. That made the decision to settle look less like a company protecting itself from a real legal threat, and more like a company protecting something else entirely. That something else was almost certainly the Skydance merger. Paramount was in the middle of negotiating an enormous deal with Skydance Media, an agreement that needed sign-off from federal regulators, including the Federal Communications Commission. Settling a lawsuit from a sitting president, while that approval process was underway, raised obvious questions about whether corporate strategy was quietly steering editorial decisions. Colbert wasn't willing to let it slide. Opening his show, he told his audience that as someone who had always considered himself a loyal employee of the network, he felt genuinely offended by what had happened. He didn't dance around his opinion of the settlement. He flatly called it a bribe, dressed up in corporate language, but obvious in its intent. The studio audience roared with approval. Clips of the monologue spread everywhere within hours. And then, just 72 hours later, CBS announced his show was ending. Nobody at CBS ever confirmed a direct connection between the monologue and the cancellation. Officially, there wasn't supposed to be one, but the sequence of events did the talking that the press releases wouldn't. What happened next said as much about Colbert's standing in the industry as anything that came before it. This wasn't a quiet, forgettable cancellation. It became a genuine flashpoint. Fellow comedians spoke up almost immediately. Jon Stewart, who had given Colbert his start decades earlier at The Daily Show, defended him publicly. David Letterman, the man whose desk Colbert had inherited, criticized the decision. Even members of Congress weighed in, with Senator Elizabeth Warren among those questioning whether the timing of the cancellation was really just a coincidence. But it was Jimmy Kimmel's response that stood out the most. Rather than treating Colbert's departure as an opportunity to pick up ratings for himself, Kimmel did something almost unheard of in a competitive industry. He aired a rerun on the night of Colbert's farewell episode, actively encouraging his own viewers to tune into his rival instead. It was a small gesture in terms of airtime, but a massive one in terms of what it signaled. Kimmel wasn't just being polite. He was making a statement about solidarity in an industry that suddenly felt a lot less secure than it had a year earlier. That gesture turned out to be only the beginning of Kimmel's support. Sometime after Colbert's final broadcast, Kimmel extended a genuine invitation. During his own show's annual summer hiatus, Jimmy Kimmel Live traditionally hands the desk over to a rotating lineup of celebrity guest hosts. Kimmel offered Colbert a spot in that rotation, a chance to stay visible, stay sharp, and keep his name in the late-night conversation while he figured out his next move. For most television personalities in Colbert's position, freshly out of a job after nearly a decade at the top, an offer like that would have been an easy yes. It solved several problems at once. It kept him working, it kept him relevant, and it came from a friend rather than a competitor looking to capitalize on his misfortune. Colbert turned it down. He didn't do it publicly, and he didn't make a big production out of the decision. According to Kimmel, who later discussed the exchange in an interview with Variety, Colbert's reasoning came down to timing. It simply felt too soon. Colbert wasn't ready to step behind another network's desk, even temporarily, even as a guest, while the wound from his own cancellation was still fresh. It wasn't about ego, and by all accounts it wasn't about any friction between the two men. Quite the opposite. Kimmel made it clear the door was still open, telling Colbert that whenever he was ready to host, he would gladly step aside and hand him the platform. That single phrase, too soon, is really the heart of this story. It's a small detail, but it explains a lot about how Colbert was actually processing what had just happened to him, in contrast to the public, defiant image many assumed he'd want to project. It's worth sitting with just how abrupt Colbert's exit really was. This wasn't a host easing into retirement after a long, celebrated farewell tour. This was a sudden, contract-driven ending that arrived just days after he had publicly criticized his own employer on air. Whatever the official explanation, Colbert stepped away from a chair he had occupied for nearly a decade under circumstances that were, at minimum, deeply uncomfortable. Walking straight into another host chair, even briefly, even as a favor from a friend, would have meant performing normalcy before he'd had any real time to process what had actually happened. There's also the matter of appearances. Guest hosting for Kimmel so soon after leaving CBS could easily have been read by the press as Colbert auditioning for a new full-time gig, or worse, as evidence that his big fat bribe comment had been calculated rather than sincere, a stunt designed to manufacture a dramatic exit rather than an honest reaction. Declining the offer let Colbert control his own narrative instead of letting speculation fill in the blanks. It gave him room to step back from the spotlight entirely rather than immediately reappearing under someone else's banner. And then there's the simplest explanation of all. Grief takes time, even professional grief. Colbert had spent 9 years building an identity around that desk, that format, that nightly rhythm. Declining Kimmel's offer wasn't a rejection of his friend. It was an acknowledgement that he needed space before he could figure out what came next, if anything did at all. Kimmel's support for Colbert takes on even more weight when you consider what he himself was going through around the same time. In September of 2025, ABC abruptly pulled Jimmy Kimmel Live off the air following a monologue in which Kimmel addressed the assassination of conservative activist Charlie Kirk. Contrary to a lot of the outrage that followed, Kimmel hadn't joked about Kirk's death or treated it lightly. His criticism was aimed at what he saw as certain figures on the political right trying to spin the tragedy for their own advantage before the facts were even settled. That distinction got lost almost immediately in the ensuing firestorm. Conservative commentators, elected officials, and major affiliate groups, including Nexstar and Sinclair, pushed back hard. And ABC made the decision to suspend the show indefinitely while it assessed the situation. The suspension became a national story almost overnight, drawing in free speech advocates on one side and Kimmel's critics on the other. More than 400 people from across the entertainment industry signed an open letter, organized with backing from the ACLU, condemning the suspension as an attack on free expression. Notably, some of the support came from people who didn't even agree with Kimmel politically, but felt strongly that pulling the show set a troubling precedent. Just 6 days later, ABC reversed its decision and brought the show back. When Kimmel returned, he didn't try to brush past what had happened. In an emotional opening monologue, visibly fighting back tears at points, he told viewers plainly that it had never been his intention to make light of a young man's murder, and that he didn't see anything funny about it at all. He reminded his audience that he'd posted a message of condolence to Kirk's family the moment the news broke, and that he meant every word of it just as much days later. He clarified that his criticism had never been directed at Kirk, but at people he believed were exploiting a tragedy for political gain. Seen side by side, Colbert's cancellation and Kimmel's suspension tell a similar story about where late-night television found itself by the second half of 2025. Both men had spent years as two of Donald Trump's most consistent television critics. Both had become frequent targets of his public attacks. And within the span of a few months, both found themselves at the center of controversies that put their networks' relationships with politics, advertisers, and regulators under a microscope in a way that hadn't happened in decades. What makes the Kimmel-Colbert dynamic so interesting is that these two men were never really direct rivals in the personal sense, even though their shows competed head-to-head for years. They came up through different corners of comedy. Kimmel through a background in radio and prank-heavy sketch comedy, Colbert through the dense political satire of The Daily Show and The Colbert Report. But they ended up occupying strikingly similar positions in the media landscape. Both built their later career reputations on sharp, unapologetic political commentary. Both became lightning rods for criticism from the same political direction. And when the moment came, both showed up for each other rather than treating the other's misfortune as an opportunity. That's part of why Kimmel's offer, and Colbert's polite refusal of it, resonates the way it does. It wasn't a business transaction. It was one friend trying to throw another a rope during a genuinely disorienting moment in his career, and the other friend, appreciative but not yet ready, choosing to sit with the moment instead of grabbing it. As of now, Colbert hasn't announced any return to a nightly hosting format, and there's no confirmed deal with a streaming platform or a rival network. Speculation about podcasts or new projects continues to circulate, as it tends to with any major personality who steps away from a spotlight, but nothing has been made official. What is public is that Colbert has taken on a role as an executive producer on The Lord of the Rings, The Hunt for Gollum, tapping into a lifelong love of Tolkien's work that long predates his television career. It's a notably different kind of project from nightly political satire. And maybe that's the point. After nearly a decade of turning the day's headlines into monologue material, stepping into a fantasy franchise project offers something Colbert's old job never could: distance from the news cycle entirely. Whether he eventually returns to a hosting chair, Kimmel's, someone else's, or a brand new one entirely, remains an open question. But the story of why he said no to that first offer says something important about how he's chosen to handle this chapter of his career. Rather than rushing to prove he still belonged in the spotlight, Colbert chose to step back and let the moment breathe. Pull back far enough, and this entire saga becomes about more than just two hosts and their friendship. It's a window into what late-night television has actually become in the mid-2020s. An industry squeezed by shrinking ad revenue and streaming competition, but also one increasingly entangled with corporate mergers, regulatory approval processes, and political pressure from the very top of government. Colbert's exit and Kimmel's suspension happened only weeks apart, both involving hosts who built their brands on holding power accountable, both unfolding against a backdrop of nervous corporate parents trying to protect bigger financial interests. CBS has never wavered from its official explanation that Colbert's cancellation was purely about economics. Maybe that's even partly true, The financial pressures on network late night are real and well documented. But the timing, the monologue, the merger, and the reaction from across the industry all make it awfully hard to believe economics was the whole story. In the middle of all that noise, one small, quiet decision stands out. A tired, freshly displaced host telling his friend that the timing just wasn't right, and that friend responding not with pressure, but with patience. It's a small moment in a much larger story, but it might be the most human one in the entire saga. A reminder that behind the ratings wars, the corporate statements, and the political firestorms, these are still just people trying to figure out what comes next.